We're having a conversation. I'm deciding I'm going to listen to you, right? That's different than how people generally communicate, because usually when they communicate, they're doing something like, okay, we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to tell you why I'm right and I'll win if you agree. Or maybe you're having a conversation where, I don't know what you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to impress the person you're talking to. So you're not listening to them at all. You're just thinking about what you're going to say next. Okay, so that's not this. This is, you might have something to tell me. And so I'm going to listen on the off chance that you'll tell me something that would really be useful for me to know. You could think about it as an extension of the Piagetian, Piaget talked about the fundamentally important element of knowledge being to describe how knowledge is sought, the process by which knowledge is generated. If you agree with me and I find that out, I know nothing more than I knew before. I just know what I knew before. And maybe I'm happy about that because, it didn't get challenged. But I'm no smarter than I was before. But maybe you're different than me, and so while I'm listening to you, you'll tell me something I don't like. Maybe it's something I find contemptible or difficult, whatever. Maybe you'll tell me something I don't know, and then I won't be quite as stupid. And then maybe I won't run painfully into quite as many things. And that's a really useful thing to know, especially if you live with someone and you're trying to make long-term peace with them, is they're not the same as you. And their way they look at the world and the facts that they pull out of the world aren't the same as your facts. Even though you're going to be overwhelmed with the proclivity to demonstrate that you're right, it is the case that two brains are better than one. Maybe 9 of the 10 things they tell you are dispensable, or maybe even 49 out of 50, but one thing, all you need to get out of the damn conversation is one thing you don't know. And one of the things that's very cool about a good psychotherapeutic session is that the whole conversation is like that. All you're doing is trying to express the truth of the situation as clearly as possible. That's it. Now, Roger's proposition, and I'll tell you why he derived it, was that if you have a conversation like that with someone, it will make both of you better. It'll make both of you psychologically healthier. So there's an implicit presupposition that the exchange of truth is curative. Well, that's a very cool idea. I mean, it's a very deep idea. I think it's the most profound idea. It's the idea upon which Western civilization, although not only Western civilization, is actually predicated. The idea that truth produces health. But for Rogers, that was the entire purpose of the Psychotherapeutic Alliance. You come to see me because you want to be better. You don't even know what that means necessarily, neither do I. We're going to figure that out together. But you come and you say, look, things are not acceptable to me, and maybe there's something I could do about that. So that's the minimal precondition to engage in therapy. If something's wrong, you're willing to talk about it truthfully, and you want it to be better. Without that, the therapeutic relationship does not get off the ground. And so then you might ask, well, what relationships are therapeutic? And the answer to that would be, if you have a real relationship, it's therapeutic. If it isn't, what you have is not a relationship. God only knows what you have. You're a slave, they're a tyrant, you're both butting heads with one another. It's a primate dominance hierarchy dispute. Oh, I don't know, you're like 2 cats in a barrel, or 2 people with their hands around each other's throats. But what you have is not a relationship. We may say that the greater the communicated congruence of experience, awareness, and behavior on the part of one individual, that's a reference to the same idea that I was describing with regards to Jung. So you come and talk to me and you want things to go well. Well, I'm going to have to more or less be one thing, because if I'm all over the place, you can't trust any continuity in what I say. There's no reason for you to believe that I'm capable of actually telling you, I'm capable of expressing anything that's true. So the truth is something that emerges as a consequence of getting yourself lined up and beating all the impurities out of your soul, for lack of a better word. You have to be integrated for that to happen, and you do that at least in part by wanting to tell the truth. The more the ensuing relationship will involve a tendency towards reciprocal communication with the same qualities. One of the things, I've been quite influenced by Rogers. One of the things I try to do in my therapeutic sessions is, first of all, to listen, to really listen. And then while I listen, I watch. And while I'm listening, things will happen in my head. Maybe I'll get a little image of something, or I'll get a thought or a question will emerge, and then I'll just tell the person what that is. But it's sort of directionless, It's not like I have a goal, except that we're trying to make things better. I'm on the side of the person, I'm on the side of the part of the person that wants things to be better, not worse. Those parts of us have a dialogue, and the consequence of that dialogue is that certain things take place, and then I'll just tell the person what happened. And it isn't that I'm right. That's not the point. The point is that they get to have an hour where someone actually tells them what they think. Here's the impact you're having on me. This is making me angry. This is making me happy. This is really interesting. This reminds me of something that you said an hour ago that I don't quite understand. The whole point is not for either person to make the proposition or convince the other that their position is correct, but merely to have an exchange of experience about how things are set up. And it's extraordinarily useful for people because it's often difficult for anyone to find anyone to talk to that will actually listen. You have written an article on how to write. Can you do the same on how to speak? Well, I suppose I could. I could tell you a little bit about it. If you're going to speak about something, you need to know a lot about it. You need to know 3 or 4 times as much as you're going to speak about at minimum. So first of all, you have to do your background research. You have to have multiple stories at hand that you can use to illustrate your point. And you have to have a point. You have to organize what you're talking about around a problem. So before I go on stage to speak on my tour, I always sit for half an hour, some of which involves usually about 5 minutes of anxiety. And I think, okay, there's a problem I'm trying to address tonight, a central problem or a theme. What is it? It might be courage, it might be responsibility, it might be meaning. I think that serves as an organizing principle. So that would be the point. And then basically I organize, say, a dozen stories around that. And I can kind of arrange them as a journey. And it's a journey that circles the main point. And so I'm trying to explore it, to say what I think about courage, let's say, but to take what I'm thinking farther than I've taken it already. And so that I can plot out, little 5-minute stories that I have that are associated with courage. And then I can talk to the audience. And I would say, talk about what you know. Use your personal experience because that's something that you're actually a master of. You can bring in other material, but it has to be tied to the real world through your own experience. Otherwise, it's not real. It's also very good to speak directly to the audience, to the individuals in the audience, because I'm always looking at a single person, one after another, and focusing on them and talking to them, just like you'd have a conversation with someone. And that way I can see if they're following along. And I'm always listening to the audience. What I really like to hear from the audience is no noise at all, silence. Because if the audience, especially, if it's a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people, if the audience is dead silent, then I know that I'm on the right track. And the other thing I would say is you're telling stories, so every fact that you relate or every set of facts has to be tied to a story. There has to be a meaningful output, which is something like, why is it important to your life that you know this fact? How is it related to how you're going to conduct yourself moving forward or how you're going to see the world? So, because that's kind of the essence of meaning. How does this fact change the way you perceive the world or act in the world? That's the meaning of the fact. And facts without meaning are dull. So you need to know that. You need to tell the truth, that's for sure. And for me, my talks are they're an attempt to explore a set of ideas in the most truthful way that I can manage. And that's also an adventure because letting yourself speak freely about a topic, you don't always know where it's going to go. And so, but that also hooks in the audience because they're along for the ride, right? And there's a risk. The risk is you might forget where you are, you might lose the thread, you might say something you regret, you might get confused. The talk should be a process of exploration, like a journey that you're taking the audience along on. It's the same when you're reading a novel. Like a great novel isn't exactly plotted out from beginning to end to begin with. The author is taking himself or herself and you on an intellectual adventure through the character development, and the characters have to be allowed to live and to express themselves, and the novel needs to unfold. It's like a colloquy between the conscious mind and the unconscious source of inspiration. The novel is actually a journey through a characterological landscape, and the author shouldn't know where he or she's going to end up at the beginning. Same with an artist and who's writing a song or piece of music or piece of visual art. There has to be play and exploration along the way. And so you also don't want to deliver an over-prepared talk, in my estimation, or at least that's not how I do it. You want to have a theme, you want to have a body of knowledge from which you can draw on, and then you want to be actively exploring the idea in front of the audience. And that's very gripping for everyone, including you. And you should learn something from the talk. It's an opportunity to think on your feet. Anyways, that's my style of lecturing. It's a trapeze act without a safety net, I would say.
say, and that's part of what makes it gripping, is that there's a high probability of failure. And I would say with any performance that's going to be gripping, that on the edge of the seat gripping, there has to be a high probability of failure. And that's why I don't speak with notes. If you speak with notes, which you might have to if you're a beginning speaker, then you cannot fail because you can always read the notes. And so there's a net. You'll fall in the net, but you won't die. But you'll never do anything spectacular. So that's the thing, is if you're going to do something spectacular, you have to take the risk. And if you're going to take the risk, you have to think on your feet. And then you also have to have something to think about. You have to have been working on this material. You know, I've been working on the stuff I talk about for 30 years, for tens of thousands of hours. And so I have that reservoir of knowledge, I suppose. And, you know, whenever I read something new, I'm slotting it into the knowledge structure that I use to generate my talks. And I'm reading all the time. And lots of the things I read, I forget. They're not relevant to my central mission, whatever that happens to be. It looks something like the delineation of the relationship between responsibility and meaning, and maybe responsibility, meaning, and perception. It's something like that. And so I have a central concern, or deeper than that in some sense. My central concern was how to ensure personally that if I was tempted in a situation like the situations that arose in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, that I wouldn't fall prey to those totalitarian systems and act in the reprehensible manner that so many people acted in. That's really been a driving concern of mine. And that bleeds over into the relationship between meaning and responsibility and perception. So there's a core set of problems that I'm working on, and every talk is an attempt to further develop those. So you also have to have a problem, you know? You think, well, you don't want to have a problem. It's like, yeah, you do. You've got problems anyways. If you're alive, you've got problems. Pick one of them. It can be your problem, and that can be the problem you try to address, whatever that happens to be. And then you have something to talk about. How am I going to address this problem? How can this problem be addressed? So you need to have a problem too if you're going to talk, just like you need to have a problem if you're going to write, because the writing is an attempt to solve the problem, and so is the talking. If you're not trying to solve a problem, what the hell are you doing talking? Why should anyone care? It's got to be a real problem too, like a nail biter of a problem, a dragon of a problem. And if it's a problem that everyone else shares, so much the better. And then you grapple with it.
Speaking in the appropriate way, you can get all sorts of things churned up in the unconscious minds of your listeners. And by watching them as well, you can extract out their unconscious desires. So now, I'm speaking to you all, and you're all irritated because your life has been really awful for 15 years. And I'm saying this, and I'm saying that, and I'm saying this, and I'm saying that. Initially dismissive of Jews. And you're all mad, and there's 2 or 3 people who go, yeah! And then I think, oh, you know, that's kind of an interesting response. And then lay out a couple more ideas, and some of them don't get any response. And others, you know, people perk right up. And I'm not stupid. And I'm trying to get the bloody attention of the crowd. If I do that 50 times, the crowd's going to tell me an awful lot about what they want, especially if I'm willing to follow them. And I can do that easily because, especially if I can start to work the crowd a little bit, because I can capitalize on their emotions and the display of that emotion, and I can learn to play that. And then that turns into a positive feedback loop. And so Hitler's informing the audience, and the audience is informing Hitler, and that's why Jung believed that Hitler embodied the shadow of the German people. So that's another reason why you should be careful what you say, and why you say it, you know, and why you're looking for attention, and all of those things, and actually what's motivating you, and actually what's motivating the people who are listening to you. Because God only knows where it might go if you're not careful. Well, actually, we do know where it goes if you're not careful, and it's not pretty, that's for sure. And to think that we've learned anything from that, it's like, no, that's not right. We haven't learned a damn thing from it, because we don't want to understand it. Now, these guys are all concerned with that sort of thing. They're highly concerned with it. Now, Binswanger and Boss had both been influenced by Freud and by Jung. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, that's Boss with Jung, and that's Binswanger on the left and Boss at the top there. So, you know, they're pretty thoughtful-looking guys, and they were pretty damn smart, and they were quite philosophically oriented, and they had both studied Heidegger, and they'd both studied Husserl, who were German philosophers. Heidegger actually got tangled right up into the Nazi movement, and his philosophy has been cast under a cloud of suspicion, perhaps a well-deserved cloud of suspicion, as a consequence of his cooperation with the Nazis. So it wasn't only stupid people who got tangled up in this, it was pretty much everybody who got tangled up in it. And one of the things you might think about, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you were there, for any one of you, there's a 90% chance that you would have got tangled up in it. You wouldn't have been the person who rescued the gypsies. It's like, forget that. Unless you think that, you know, you're heroic far beyond the average, and I would be very, very careful about assuming that. You could assume instead that you would have been swept along with the crowd just like everyone else, because everyone everyone else was. Part of what these guys were trying to figure out is, in some sense, there were two things. There was the function and structure of belief systems, and then the nature of that which transcends a belief system. What transcends a belief system is what you don't know if you use that belief system, right? Because there are things outside of your belief system, and they have a nature as well. And you usually run into those sorts of things when you make a mistake, and things don't happen the way you expect them to or want them to or desire them to. And then the other problem they're trying to solve in some sense is, well, what's the appropriate mode of behavior for an individual in relationship to belief systems and to the world that transcends the belief system? And the reason they were interested in that is because they thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea if our belief systems didn't get so damn pathological. Because if they do, then, 6 million people end up in ovens or the equivalent, and 120 million people end up dead in battlefields. And, that doesn't count the Stalin massacres or Mao, who made Hitler, in some sense, look like an absolute amateur. I mean, Stalin starved 6 million people to death in the Ukraine in the 1930s, and he was just warming up. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Ukraine famine? How many of you haven't? Yeah, well, think about that. How many of you knew Mao killed 100 million people? How many of you didn't? Yeah, well, you might think about why you don't know that. You know about the damn Nazis, but you don't know about the horrors that the communists perpetrated. It's worth thinking about why, because the communists, especially the Maoists, man, those people were brutal. It's really important, like, of all the things we could possibly learn psychologically from the 20th century, and is what these characters in the 50s were concentrating on. It's like, okay, things can go powerfully sideways. It was quite a shock to everyone because in some sense, everyone was pretty thrilled at the beginning of the 19th century that classical religion beliefs had crumbled. The Marxists said, well, the damn religions were only there to oppress the poor anyways and to keep the priesthood and the aristocracy in power. I'm sure you learn plenty of that in your classes, that sort of thinking. It's power economics related thinking, and it's typical of intellectually manipulative left-wing thinkers. I would say that's basically their routine. They reduce everything to a single damn motivation. It's usually economics or power. Then they explain everything from that perspective. It's so boneheaded it should be illegal.
I write about this a fair bit in 12 Rules for Life. There's a chapter, I think it's chapter 9. I think that's right. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. It's kind of a derivation of some things that I learned from Carl Rogers, who was a great clinician, great 20th century clinician. His star sort of rose during the 1960s. He was a humanist. He was a Christian missionary when he was a kid, but he dropped that and he became a leading light in humanistic psychology. And he was really interested in the preconditions for therapeutic conversation. And he thought that if you were going to engage in the process of therapy with a client, that the client had to bring to the session before he or she arrived the willingness to make things better. That would be the first thing. And I've done therapy that was court mandated. It's like, I wouldn't recommend that. That just doesn't work very well, because you can't force someone to be better. They have to kind of come already thinking that there's a bunch of things they don't know and that their life could be better than it already is. And that's a good position to take when you're engaging in a conversation with someone. It's like, look, if you already know enough, more power to you, man. But if you're suffering more than you think is necessary, which is like highly probable, or more than you think is desirable, which basically means if you're suffering more than you think is desirable, that means that you're way more ignorant than you need to be, right? That's what it means, because maybe you have an illness, you don't know how to cure it. Maybe you're having a fight with someone, you don't know how to get out of it. Maybe you're failing at work and you don't know what to do about it. It's like you're ignorant, and no wonder, because people are ignorant. And so you might think, well, unless everything is just the way you want it to be, then you have something to learn. And then you think, well, maybe the person you're talking to, no matter how uncomfortable you are with their opinions and how bent out of shape you think they are, maybe even how bent out of shape they actually are, there's always the possibility that if you actually engaged in a conversation, you asked them questions and you tried to figure out what they thought, that you'd come away with one crumb of knowledge more than you had when you went into the conversation. And like conversations like that are a lot more interesting. I've probably done 20,000 hours of clinical work, something like that. And so that's 20,000 hours of really, 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 really serious conversations. And they're almost always interesting beyond belief. And like I've had clients that I told you already that sort of spanned the entire spectrum, from people who were impaired cognitively and behaviorally, that, well, they were utterly unemployable by any reasonable standards, to people who were unbelievably high functioning. And I found working with all of them, if I'm in the zone properly, it's ridiculously fascinating, because people are ridiculously interesting and everyone has their own characteristic experience that's actually unique. And so if you have a real conversation with someone and they tell you what's unique about their experience, the probability that you can learn something from that is Well, it's certain that you can. My low IQ clients, God, they taught me so much. They taught me how difficult things were first, because to see someone struggle with a task that the typical person can do without even thinking sheds light on exactly how amazing it is that normal people can do that, and how hard it is when you're impaired to the point where those sorts of normal behaviors become impossible. It's so enlightening. It teaches you a lot about the world. And so I think part of the reason that YouTube is killing television is partly because it's technologically advantageous. I mean, make no mistake about it. There's nothing that TV can do that YouTube can't do. And there's a whole bunch of things that YouTube can do that TV can't. So it's obvious which one's going to win. But what's also interesting about it is that there seems to be a massive and relatively untapped market for actual conversation. And it's because conversation is between people of goodwill who are trying to tell the truth, who are trying to aim at making things better, is unbelievably valuable. At least in principle, that's what we're all doing here, right? I mean, even though you guys aren't talking, that doesn't mean this isn't a conversation. First of all, we're trying to pay attention to you at least enough to see if everyone is engaged in the conversation. If you're not engaged in it, then it would be completely pointless, right? Well, one of the things I learned in my clinical practice is that if the conversation wasn't interesting, then I was doing it wrong.
My question is, if I could be half as good at communicating as you are, I would be set. How can I teach myself to do that?
Practice. Well, there's a couple of things. It helps to read a lot. It really helps to write. So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about. This is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some tricks, techniques, let's say, is like if you're speaking in front of a group, you are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably not, because it's too intimidating. But there isn't 1,000 people there. There's 1,000 individuals. And so you just look at an individual and you say something, and you can tell if they're engaged. They look confused, or they look interested, or they look angry, or they look bored, or maybe they're asleep, in which case you look at someone else. And they give you feedback about how you're doing. And so one thing is to have something to say. The next thing is pay attention to who you're talking to. Because unless you're very badly socialized, and that seems unlikely in your case, because you present yourself at least moderately well, and well, I mean, I don't know you very well, but on first sight, you're doing fine. So the probability that if you pay attention to the individuals that you're talking to, that your natural wealth of social skill will manifest itself is extremely high. And so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience. So the last thing I would say is, well, having the aim to be a good communicator is a good start. And you think, well, I could buttress that to some degree. Well, there isn't anything that you can possibly, this is the whole point of a liberal education, there isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. And this is something that the liberal arts colleges, I think, I don't know if they've forgotten it, but they don't do a very good job of marketing. It's like, well, what's the use of a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts? It's like, well, you can think, you can write, you can speak, you've read something. The economic value of that is incalculable. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful are They have skills, clearly. That's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful. Well, that's kind of like the definition of success in life, right? You negotiate and you're successful. It doesn't mean you win. If you're a really good negotiator, everybody walks away from the negotiation thrilled. And so then people line up to do things with you. That's all dependent on your ability to communicate. So practice.
Thank you very much.